Draco Malfoy and the Mortifying Ordeal of Being in Love by Is This Self-Care? Narrated by S.E.P. Author notes for this chapter. A hand-wavy note that, in this alternate universe, those who aren't actively looking to procreate are on some long-term contraceptive or other. No babies from the debaucheries. Sorry, Narcissa. Chapter 31. The Janus Thicky Ward. Dawn rose gray the next morning. Rain pitter-pattered against the window. In that damp silence, Draco the Quash Malfoy and Hermione no capacity for complications Granger stared at the ceiling and reflected upon what they had done. It was difficult to deny what had happened, given that each had the other's bodily fluids in various stages of evaporation upon their person. The pillow talk was brief and to the point. What happened in Spain would stay in Spain. They were professionals. They were professionals who respected each other's professionalism and would never act in any way other than professionally with their assigned professional. They repeated the word to the point of semantic satiation, grew confused, and left for home. Draco's wank bank benefited from some new additions, so not all was lost. If Granger hadn't a single brain cell to spare before, now, with the acquisition of the Hope from Pandora's box, the entirety of her being was consumed by her project. In the days that followed, she reached the final brewing stage for the proto-sanitatum that spent every waking hour at the laboratory, preparing to synthesize her miracle and launch clinical trials. November's full moon crept towards them. Greyback and Granger were in the fraught arms race. Now, infection versus the cure. Watching Granger's feverish work at the lab, Draco knew that illicit activities with her aura, including a night in Spain that hadn't happened, were the last thing on her mind. As the full moon approached, her drive to complete the treatment bordered on the manic. Her pace was frenetic. She ate only when reminded to, and often had to be bullied into going home to bed. There was a blankness in her eyes when she looked at Draco, sometimes, but it wasn't occlusion. Her mind was obsessively, fervidly elsewhere. The fire in her was a dangerous thing. It made her so bright, but it also threatened to consume her. He missed her so very much. When he wasn't with Granger at King's Hall, Draco joined Potter, Weasley, and their team in the search for Greyback. Potter's chase was as mad-eyed and frenetic as Granger's lab work. They pursued every lead that Draco had dragged out of Larson. Those yielded some captures, but not bloody Greyback. Shacklebolt received an emissary from the largest vampire clan in the UK. The cadaverous fellow, a Mr. Dragavi, informed the minister that several clans had been approached by Greyback to join his cause, as the rumors was now that Granger's treatment could eventually cure vampirism. Dragavi was adamant that, by and large, vampires had no quarrel with Granger and her treatment. Those stupid enough to want to give up the exquisite delights of vampirism were free to do so. The clans would be staging no actions against Granger and wished to remain well out of the conflict. If Shacklebolt would be kindly not to send oars after them, it would be much appreciated. Thank you, Minister. Shacklebolt relayed the story with a shudder. Dragavi had concluded with an offer of drinks and told Shacklebolt that, by the by, he smelled delicious. With November came the completion of the Janus Thicky renovation project. St. Mungo's, bolstered by the Malfoy gift, had not mucked about. They employed the finest magical architects and engineers to accelerate the demolition and build process, resulting in a fully renovated facility within 3 months. St. Mungo's arranged a celebration to commemorate the completion of the new ward. Both Draco and Granger were of course invited as guests of honor. Granger agreed to step out of her laboratory for 1 hour to attend. Draco gave Smethwick a list of stringent security measures that would have to be adhered to if he wanted Healer Granger there in person. The celebration took place in the ward itself. Those patients who did not wish to participate retreated into their private suites. Because, yes, they now had private suites. Upon his arrival at the ward, Draco ensured that the Aurors and DMLE operatives on duty were at their posts and did a legitimacy survey of the attendees. Granger arrived shortly after having received his jot that all was clear. Draco was just able to ascertain that she was looking lovely in a set of soft pink robes when she was surrounded by a crowd and disappeared from view. "Mr. Malfoy, welcome," said Smethwick, appearing at Draco's elbow, with a G&T for him. "May I offer you a tour? Let us begin with the medical facilities. Here on the main floor, a consultation room, 3 treatment rooms, and, my favorite, an operating theater." Draco was pleased by what he saw as they went. The new facility was impressive, but more importantly, he was certain that Granger would be overjoyed. The ward had been magically expanded and divided into 2 floors. A large entrance foyer opened above into an enchanted ceiling a la Hogwarts, reflecting the day's weather. Today, a gray November sky. On the upper level, there were 30 suites and a lounge. The lower level now featured an exercise studio, a small library, and a cafeteria, currently serving drinks and finger foods to the guests. At the far end of the ward, there were a few scraggly plants that had once struggled for existence. There was now a vast windowed wall looking out over London. An indoor garden had been built there. A small group was stepping through it with sounds of delight. Longbottom and his parents. Pansy brought up the rear, a steadying hand on Frank Longbottom's back. A corridor led to a hydrotherapy pool, jutting out of the main building in a feat of magical architecture. It was encircled by windows on all sides, surrounded by tropical plants. A man pounced about in a disturbingly small bathing suit with a long-suffering nurse at his heels. Draco recognized this luscious, if graying, flop of hair. Lockhart. Near the garden was a piano. One of the patients was playing something gentle on it. Her family clustered about her with smiles upon their faces. It was lavender brown. It jarred Draco seeing her. It reminded him that Greyback had been victimizing innocents for years, and was still doing it. He wondered if Granger's treatment might do anything about her scars. He turned away to find himself looking at yet another Greyback victim, Remus Lupin. Lupin, looking frail, was leaning on Tonks's arm, a cane in his hand. Tonks wore a tailored men's suit for the celebration, and frankly pulled it off better than most men. Tonks was fiercely protective of her private life. She had never mentioned that Lupin had become a patient here. He was the mellow voice that Draco had heard upon his first visit to the ward. They were speaking with Granger. All three of them were pointing up to the enchanted ceiling and smiling. Lupin spotted Draco and waved him over. Draco had spoken with Lupin a few times over the years, at the occasional Aura Christmas party and other events here and there. He did not like speaking with Lupin. Lupin always looked at him with a sad sort of kindness, the kindness of a teacher who watched you make poor choices and almost destroy yourself, but still remembers the child you were. It made Draco feel squeamish, that underserved, unspoken caring. Today, however, there was a frank joy and a smile that split Lupin's gaunt face. The man of the hour. Don't flatter him too much, sniffed Tonks. He's already unmanageable. Unmanageable? Draco? I don't believe it, said Lupin, shaking Draco's hand. Granger was holding back a smile. Draco was certain that she had a few opinions of her own on his manageability. Exclamations followed on the pool, the piano, the suites, the garden. Granger was delighted by everything and rather looked as though she wished to pounce on Draco. He positioned himself within an appropriate radius, but she did not proceed. Tonks and Lupin were drawn away by their children, who wanted to play on the piano. This came together beautifully, said Granger, positively vibrating. I'd squeeze the life out of you, but too many witnesses. Pity. It'd be a good way to go. They finally fixed that bloody sign. Have they? Draco observed the new sign. I'll miss the anus hickey ward. It did have a certain cachet. What's this about anus hickeys? Came a voice. It was Theo. We think you look like one, said Draco. Granger laughed. It was good to see. She was still there, somewhere, under that work fever. Fuck off, Draco. Hermione, hello. You look ravishing. Theo bent over Granger's hand and brushed a kiss onto it. Which was true, she did, but it was not Theo's place to say so. Draco, tight-jawed, conveyed this to Theo by impaling him with his eyes. How go the sonnets, Draco? Asked Theo. Draco glared. Shall I recite one for you? No. Coward. Granger looked politely confused. What are you doing here anyway? Asked Draco. Auntie Maud. Theo gestured over his shoulder, where a patient in a long gown was looking seductively at one of the waiters. You're related to Maud? Asked Granger. That explains so much. Does it? She's an insatiable flirt. Runs in the family. I wanted to say, well done. You two, this place is brilliant. Did you see the pool? I've half a mind to order the same thing done at Knott Manor. Theo helped himself to a spring roll from Draco's plate. Then he stole a stuffed mushroom. Then he plucked Draco's napkin from his hand, used it, and returned it. Piss off, you bloody seagull, said Draco, waving his hand at him. Go see to your aunt. Theo turned around. Oh no, what is she doing? Auntie Maud was eating a cocktail sausage, but indecently. I must away, said Theo. Well done again. How wonderful to see you doing some good in the world, Draco. I always knew you had it in you. He turned to Granger and pressed his hands to hers. He is a good man, you know, under all the dickheadery. Theo left and pretended not to hear Draco inform him that he was a bellend. Now that they were alone again, Draco was formulating a compliment for Granger, because he refused to be shown up by Theo. However, something plucked at his trouser leg and interrupted. A toddler was holding a damp cocktail sausage of dubious, modish provenance up to him for his inspection. "Hello?" called Draco to the room at large. "There's an unsupervised fetus here." "That's Mr. Belford's grandchild," said Granger, looking about. "Oh, the family is in the garden." Granger put her hands on her knees and complimented the sausage. She hadn't complimented Draco's sausage, by the way. Simply a note upon the injustice. Perhaps he too ought to parade it about, slightly moist. Granger swept up the child to return it to its parents, leaving Draco with an empty plate, a dirty napkin, and an unspoken compliment. His mood was not improved by his next visitor, the absolute throbber that was McLaggen. There were far too many malformed sausages at this party. McLaggen was looking quite handsome in a suit and tie. Draco noted that he had chosen a muggle suit. It annoyed him. "Well done, mate," said McLaggen, shaking Draco's hand. "Incredible gift." Draco was on a mate basis with very few people, and McLaggen was not one of them. He gave the man a smile that hardly merited the name. It was a mere tightening of the lips, a at best. McLaggen prattled on about the ward for a bit, before reaching the real reason for his visit. "Can I ask you something rather, personal?" he asked. "What?" "Are you and Hermione—" "Are we what?" "Seeing each other? Together?" "Seeing each other? Daily. Together? All the time." Together? Absurd. They merely maintained a complicated equilibrium out of mutual paranoia and reasons, and shagged during pagan holidays, and pretended it didn't happen, and he said nothing because he didn't do feelings, but he suffered in anguish because he had them anyway, and the more he tried to quash her out of his heart, the more she lived there. A bright thing in dark places, but it was fine and all under control. "No," said Draco, to sum it up succinctly. "Ah, is she seeing anyone? Do you know?" "I don't know, and frankly don't care," said Draco, while caring deeply. "Right. I only thought to ask you, because you two seem friendly." "Friendly." McLaggen gestured to the ward around them. "You just did all of this and said it was for her, mate." "It was. She saved my life." "Right." They took a sip of their respective drinks, eyeing each other with thinly veiled dislike. "May I now ask you something personal?" asked Draco. "All right." "What makes you think you're good enough for her?" McLaggen stared at him. The offense came upon him slowly. He stood to face Draco, shoulders square, face reddening. "What do you mean by that, exactly?" "Which word didn't you understand? Never mind. Let me rephrase. You're not good enough for her." McLaggen had finished processing the insult, and since he hadn't the brains for a verbal resolution, he appeared to be moving to the next stage. They were either about to exchange hexes or fisticuffs. "You needn't be so offended," said Draco with a careless shrug. "I'm not sure anyone is good enough for her." This gave McLaggen pause. His fist, which had been bullied at his side, relaxed. "She can decide who's good enough for her." "I agree. But she likes to play hard to get. Has done since Hogwarts. She just needs a little nudge." "A nudge?" "I've got leverage." "Have you?" asked Draco. "What sort of leverage?" "Strategic seats on strategic boards." "A real knicker-dropper of a move, that." McLaggen shrugged. "The usual enticements don't work on her. Money, looks, as you might have discovered." "I haven't." Draco's next question was eminently casual. "Have you spoken to Smethwick today?" "Hippocrates? No. Why?" "I believe he's got a bit of news for you." "What news?" "I suppose there's no harm in telling you now," mused Draco. "You are no longer a member of the St. Mungo's Board of Directors." "What?" Draco looked apologetic. "I had you removed. Sorry, mate." McLaggen sputtered. "You what? Who the bloody hell do you think you are? You don't decide whether or not I do. It was one of my stipulations. For a gift of this magnitude, they were happy to comply. You've apparently been considered a reputational risk for a few years. Something to do with your behavior around women, particularly Granger. They've also brought this concern to the MNHS. I believe you're one of the trustees there. I'm not certain how long you'll keep that seat either. Consider this a friendly heads-up. Perhaps you can resign and avoid losing face." In the center of the foyer, Smethwick was tapping a glass and calling for everyone's attention. "That's for me," said Draco. He placed his plate and dirty napkin in McLaggen's hands. "Hold these. There's a good lad. I've got to go." Smethwick, representatives from the MNHS, and Healer Crutchley all made speeches. Crutchley's was by far the most touching. She had seen decades of neglect turn around in a matter of months and seemed half convinced that this was all a dream. Draco and Granger were variously pulled to the front of the crowd, made to say a few words, pulled back into the crowd, pushed forwards again, toasted, photographed, and toasted again. In the mingling that followed, Draco saw Granger being approached by members of the board. Most were treating her with a cautious respect. Some approached with apprehension, as though she might get all cutty-uppy and launch herself at them with a scalpel. They needn't have worried on that front. She only did that when her auror's brains were about to be splattered onto the floor by a Viking. Narcissa had indicated to Draco that she would suffer the English damp for a few hours and look in on the celebration. She arrived in time for the speeches, tanned and still smelling like whatever terrace in Seville that she had been lingering on. When she spotted Granger, Narcissa greeted her with far more warmth than Draco would have expected. Perhaps the heat of Seville lingered in her, too. Draco was in the clutches of the Belford family, which had gathered about him to thank him and explain Mr. Belford's long-standing bubotuber hemorrhoids, which had been cured, and have their toddler holding the cocktail sausage in front of his face. Draco lured them towards Granger to hear what was being said between her and his mother. Granger was gesturing towards the ward at large and expressing gratitude in that passionate way of hers. Narcissa seemed quite taken with Granger. She pressed Granger's hands into hers. "Please do not speak to me of gratitude. You returned my son to the world of the living. This is but a gesture. You must tell me if there is anything else my family can do for you. How are your larders?" They're fine. And you've done more than enough. Really, you've gone above and beyond." "It's only money," said Narcissa with a hand wave and a lack of concern that only the truly wealthy can indulge in. She peered at the enchanted ceiling. "Draco normally has little time or patience for charity work. His mind is bent on the investment side of things, you know, and I manage the philanthropic activities. But in this case, he did remarkably well." "He did. You managed to hone a new sort of focus in him." "Oh, yes, a focus." Granger gave Narcissa one of her stiff smiles. "He seems happy. I really do just want him to be happy, you know?" "Of course." "I want him to find someone, to make him happy." Narcissa looked significantly at Granger. Granger, blushing, stared at her gin fizz as though her entire being was held in its thrall. Draco considered launching himself at Narcissa and tackling her into the ground. "Forgive me my mother's witterings on," said Narcissa. "At any rate, he has impressed me. Perhaps he will be able to take on the mantle after all. I always wished he would be more concerned with these things, you know. Did you see the little garden? I wouldn't have put the chrysanthemums quite so close to the lily grass. They get a bit lost in it, but otherwise—" The toddler escaped again and came to show Granger the cocktail sausage. "Oh," said Narcissa, "is it an orphan?" No, he belongs to the Belfords," said Granger, lifting the child up again and looking about the room. "He's going to get trod on." "Are you sure? He looks like an orphan. He's so dirty. Perhaps he's a street urchin. Why is he holding a sausage? Did he pickpocket it? Where are the nannies?" The flock of Belfords swooped by to pick up their errant child. Granger was buffeted about between family members in a whirl of thanks and congratulations and hemorrhoid updates until Narcissa's thin hand hooked around her elbow and fished her out of the vortex to resume their conversation. Draco joined them. "Ah, Draco, there you are. I was just telling Hilary Granger that you've impressed me with your management of a philanthropic exercise at this scale." "All I did was sign off on the transfer of funds. The planning was all someone else at the hospital." "Oh? Well, someone rather brilliant, I imagine," said Narcissa. "It is very well thought out. Only the chrysanthemums." Draco looked at Granger. She gave her head the most minute shake. Very well, he wouldn't point out that the brilliant someone was right here. "You did well in your speeches, Draco," continued Narcissa. "Not too verbose. Do try to smile a little next time. We don't want to look haughty. We are men of the people, etc." "Of course." Narcissa gave a little shiver and pulled her shawl more closely around her thin shoulders. "Is there a draft? I believe there's a draft. Did someone open a window? I suppose it's just me. I was just in Seville, Hilary Granger, and I shall be returning there directly. I cannot abide the English damp any more. I suppose it's age." Granger was called away to speak with reporters from the Prophet. Narcissa beckoned Draco closer with the crook of her finger. "Draco," she said in a conspiratorial whisper. There was ribudo on her breath, sherry and lemon. It wasn't the heat of Seville that was lingering in her. His mother was nicely tipsy and having a grand time of it. It explained the volubility. "What?" "I've been thinking," said Narcissa. "Oh, no." "Yes. Do we know if Healer Granger is single?" "Mother." "I am merely curious. I've been pondering possibilities. Don't be so defensive. You look as though you've licked a nettle. Do you like her? I think you ought to like her. She is not milquetoast. You still haven't told me in what capacity you are working together. I literally cannot tell you that. I've taken a vow of secrecy. Have you? It must be important then. Find out if she's single. Be proactive, Draco. Mother. I am merely making a suggestion. Passivity breeds only pain, dear. I learned this over a long life of it. Don't be like me. Oh, watch out behind you. That orphan is back again. Mind your pockets. No, no, child, I don't want the sausage. Narcissa drifted off to continue her rounds and vaguely promised to send Draco a jot when she returned to Seville. It was Draco's turn to be interviewed by the prophet. He said various nice things about the importance of long-term care and giving, all while reeling at his mother's new infatuation with Granger. The rogue toddler continued its rampage. It tugged at Longbottom's trousers with vigor. Draco looked over at precisely the wrong moment. The trousers slid down and opened before him a magnificent panorama of Longbottom's long bottom. Healer Crutchley gave Draco and Granger enormous hugs, suffocating both of them in turn in her ample chest. Granger came back up for air, looking mildly disturbed. Draco, more accustomed to tits in his face, merely fixed his hair. When they were free of Crutchley's abundant bosoms, Granger pulled Draco to the side. Smethwick's just told me about McLagan's seat on the board. Is that your doing? She asked. Me? No, I don't meddle with affairs of hospital governance. I don't believe you. You're right not to. Did Smethwick tell you who the vacant seat would be going to? No. Me, said Draco. Granger's eyebrows rose. Congratulations! A whole new pestilence of incompetence awaits you. No, it awaits you. What? I've named you my delegate for the seat. I hope that's all right. The smile, God's the smile. That is very all right, said Granger. The brightness in her eyes, the lip bite, the glance down. Whip them into shape, Granger. It will be my absolute pleasure to. They sipped their drinks. Now she was giving him a long and wondering look. What? Asked Draco. Nothing. Oh, something. I agree with Ernie. Oh? They're all right after all, these Malfoys. Draco touched his glass to hers with his most Malfoyish smirk. The celebration drew to a close. After goodbyes, Draco accompanied a disillusioned Granger to the St. Mungo's foyer, where a line of flue hearths flickered. They found the place unusually crowded. There was a crush of people milling about and sounds of confusion. Pieces of parchment were fluttering everywhere, stuck to the ceiling, fixed upon windows, blowing about. Montjoy, one of the Aurors on duty, shoved his way to Draco and Granger. Get her out of here, he muttered when he got close. What's going on? Montjoy used a low-level depulso to push people out of the way as Draco pulled Granger's invisible self towards the fires. Hundreds, thousands of these, all over the foyer, said Montjoy, snatching up a piece of parchment. Humphreys just jotted me. Says they're all over the ministry, too. There was a Gemino curse on the parchment. Even as Montjoy held it, duplicates sprang into existence and spilled onto the floor. Upon the parchment was a photograph of Granger, and below it the following lines, in a rough, uneven hand. Give me Granger, and the attacks stop. They had expected an escalation from Greyback, and there it was. It happened not in the form of another direct attack on her, but something far more insidious, something that turned the eyes of the entire wizarding population on her, and offered a hideous incentive to help Greybacks reach her. Key magical locations in the UK had received the same treatment as St. Mungo's. In collaboration with Granger, the ministry released a statement on the nature of her breakthrough, with the announcement that a cure for lycanthropy was proceeding to clinical trials. Greyback's self-interested cowardice was exposed. But, as November's full moon drew nearer, there were whispers, too. 2 terror-filled full moons had passed, and another one loomed. The population was on edge. Some had already lost. Some were terrified of losing. The damage was done. Granger could no longer go out in public. She was, for all intents and purposes, confined to the manor and the lab. She took the hardship as well as Draco could have hoped. If Greyback had intended to isolate her, he failed. Her jotter buzzed endlessly with messages of support. Her cottage was half buried in letters. Requests to participate in the clinical trials flooded her postbox at Cambridge from all over the world. The Prophet's front page was plastered with editorial outrage and letters from the populace expressing their disgust at Greyback's attempt at coercion. Narcissa sent Draco an alarm jot to make sure he kept Healer Granger safe from that lunatic, should they offer the manor to her. When Draco showed her the note, Granger smiled the first smile he'd seen in days. During November's full moon, the Danish Auror HQ sent a detachment of 30 of their own Aurors to assist with the next round of attacks. Between that and a population that was now taking the threat seriously, only 8 were infected, none killed. November faded into December. There were good moments with the bad. Granger's fire, far from being quenched by Greyback, flared even more impressively. In a moment of triumph at the lab that Draco felt honored to witness, she completed the synthesis of the first batch of doses for the cure for lycanthropy. The laboratory was rocked by shrieks, jumps, and applause as the entirety of Granger's team heaped themselves upon her. Then they all sat or laid down on the floor, and someone opened champagne, and they passed the bottle around because they were too exhausted to conjure glasses. Granger attempted to make a speech, but her voice failed, and she put her face in her hands and was racked with silent sobs. This began a chain reaction of crying throughout her team, which only ceased when 3 or 4 more bottles of champagne had been consumed. Many hours later, Draco found himself standing in a silent laboratory at midnight, with everyone asleep on the floor at his feet. He carried Granger home through the flu. Granger finished passing submissions through a hideous maze of codes, authorities, standards, and research and ethics review boards, and began her clinical trials. Lupin was amongst the first group of patients to receive a dose. Draco escorted a disillusioned Granger to St. Mungo's to administer it. Lupin's family was all around him. Tonks held one hand, his teenage son the other. His daughter was upon his knees. Granger was all gentle professionalism as she administered the infusion. There was a smile on Lupin's thin face, and hope in his eyes that matched the hope that was pushed into his veins. Draco saw Tonks cry for the first time. When Draco and Granger returned to the manor that afternoon, Granger, her own eyes rather bright, said that she fancied a walk, and would he like to come? He would, of course. They cast warming charms upon themselves, then crunched along a frosty path bordered by ferns of ice and creaking birches, silver on white. Their breath streamed behind them. For a time they said nothing. Granger was thoughtful as she picked her way past frozen puddles. Draco kept pace with her small steps, sometimes just behind her, sometimes next to her. They came to the end of the path. It gave out onto a mirror lake whose edges glittered with new frost. The air smelled cold and clear, so pure that it was dizzying to take in too deep a breath. Granger stood upon the embankment and clasped her mittened hands together. Draco came to stand next to her. They stood in silence. He nudged her with his elbow. She looked up at him. "You did it," said Draco. Granger pressed her mittens to her mouth, smiling incredulously. Yes. We need to see how the numbers come back after the first few infusions, but yes." She looked up at the sky, winnowed by the wind. It was one of those December days when the firmament is a pure blue brilliance. The white puff of her sigh was carried up by a gust and disappeared into it. There was a lovely, trembling sort of joy about her. The exhausted, can't-believe-it joy of one who has just achieved something after much effort and is slowly coming to revel in the elation of it. There were tears in her eyes. She took in a shaky breath. Draco gave her a handkerchief instead of a bone-crushing hug he wanted to give her. "I should like to point out that these are happy tears," said Granger with a sniff. "Obviously." Granger dabbed her eyes, then held the handkerchief to her chest. She cleared her throat. "I'll be writing an article in this project, now that my work is public. Perhaps even a book. And I shall have a long list of dedications and thanks. This has been the work of many hands and many minds. Everyone at the lab, of course, and so many colleagues whose work I incorporated, and the researchers that came before me, and... I'd like to add you," said Granger. An unexpected spark of happiness was lit in Draco. "Would you?" "Yes." "I'd be honored," said Draco, unable to stop a delighted grin from making its way across his face. "I haven't decided how to phrase it yet. Would you prefer anonymity? I could use some sort of epithet. I would like to thank the thorn in my side." "The nuisance-orer," suggested Draco. "The opportunistic ghoul. The real pestilence of incompetence. Crotch? Well, then you must sign off as hormone. That may be difficult to explain to the editor. Do you think partner in unspecified crimes would constitute an admission of guilt? I don't know. You're the orer. Better not. Perhaps I shall simply say, my heartfelt thanks to Draco Malfoy. I like it. Whose hair was sacrificed many times for the cause. That adds quite the gravitas. That's settled then. Thank you. We ought to celebrate. you want to invite anyone to the manor tonight? I have a bottle of 1972. 1972? Goodness, no. Save it for a special occasion. You are the special occasion. Granger laughed, then grew pensive. At length she said, Quite frankly, tonight, I'd rather do nothing at all. She looked out at the still lake. Under her coat, her shoulders relaxed. With the first infusions completed, a tremendous pressure had been lifted from her. The mania of the fire had abated. She was back in her own head again. Draco felt the change when their eyes met. Now he wasn't being repelled by fever heat and a mind too burdened to spare a thought to anything but the work. Now he was drawn in again by the usual warmth, the quiet attraction, the pull. He held out his elbow to her. Let's go do nothing at all. I don't believe anyone has ever deserved it more. They hadn't really touched each other since Spain. She looked up at him with a swift smile. He felt her grasp upon his elbow and the press of warm fingers through his cloak. She was back. His heart soared with the wind and went to meet the sky.